So what we're going to be creating today is a sparkling or glitter effect, and what we're going to cover is how to animate an emitter along a curve, setting up the particle system, and finally how to reveal the text, or it can be any other object, by using a gradient. So I've just got my regular startup scene, and I have my 3D text still in its editable form, and the first thing we need to do is set up the path that our particle emitter will travel on. So I'm just going to go into top view, Shift A, and then I'm going to add a curve Bezier and move it over, and then just start positioning the points where I want. And I'm going to go into camera view, and in my one I had it coming from off the screen over to this corner, and then I'm just going to press E to extrude, and it's going to go over here, and then E again, and it's going to come back round before looping up around the text. If I just go into top view, we can sort this out. So this can go back a bit, this will be forward, this will be about here, and then I'll just start positioning it so we can start having the path go around the text. So I'm just using the normal tools of R to rotate and S to scale, and then extrude again. So now that we've got to this point, to save us a bit of time, we can select all of this bottom row, and then going into front view, press Shift D, escape to cancel that, and then G, and then Z. And we're just going to repeat this, and these are going to be our loops of where the emitter is going to move around, and that should do it. Now, it may be a bit tricky to see because we've got a lot going on the screen, but the end of our path is here, and we're actually going to select the handle on the next row up, and we're just going to press F, and they are now joined. And so we're going to continue to do that, creating a spiral effect. So I'm going to select this one, the next row up, press F, and just continue that. So now they are looping around all as one path. And then when we get to this one, I'm just going to press E, then Z, go into front view, rotate it around the right way, and just scale this handle in to make it a bit of a sharper turn. And then just scale it down and move it up. And now if I tab out of edit mode, we can see we have a complete path. Now, one thing I do want to do is make a couple of these points a bit sharper than they are by default. So I'm going to select the handles, press T to bring up the toolbar, and then I'm going to select these handles to be of type vector. And that just makes them more pointed and sharp. So T to hide the toolbar again. And now we're actually going to create the object that is going to travel along our path. And for mine, I used a UV sphere. So Shift A, Mesh, UV sphere, and then I'm just going to press Control A and apply the location. So the origin has gone back to the center of the scene, and then press Control Alt Shift C, and that's a bit of a long combination, but we're going to choose Geometry to Origin. And you can do that through the toolbar or through one of the menus, and then we'll scale that down a bit. And we're going to make this object travel along the path by giving it a constraint, and the constraint we're going to use is Follow Path. And you can see it's red because we need a target. The target is going to be the name of the curve, so that's just Bezier curve. So we can choose that, and we're going to choose it to follow the curve. And you can already see it's jumped to the end of our curve. So then if I select the path and then go over to its object properties, you can see it has a path animation panel. Now, if you haven't done this before, the number of frames is the number of frames it will take this object to travel the length of the path. I want it to be 250. And the evaluation time is the value of how far along the path it is. So when it's at 0, it'll be 0 amount along the path. And if I set it to 250, because we've set 250 frames, it will go to the other end. And you can see it's gone to the other. And so if I drag this, you can see it animating along the path. But one problem is that it seems to be starting at the end and finishing at the beginning. And how we change that is by tabbing into edit mode on the curve, selecting everything, pressing W, and then switch direction. So now if we go back to 0, progression along the path, we can see it's at the beginning, and as we move it along towards the number 250, it gets to the end. And so this is the actual value we're going to be animating to get the path to go along, because you can see even if you scroll in the timeline, nothing happens. It's only when you alter the evaluation time value that the object will move. So I'm going to press I while the cursor is over this value, and it's gone yellow to show there's a keyframe, and then I'm going to go to frame 250 and set this to 250, and then press I again to make sure it's keyframed. And so now, if we scroll along, It's now animating. Now the next step we need to do is create the actual particle system. Now the effect that we're actually creating here is based on glitter falling through the air, and if you look at one small part of glitter, I imagine it would be a very small plane, and that's what we're going to use for the particle system object. So I've gone Shift A, I'm going to add a plane, I'm going to scale it down, and then I'm just going to add a material. And because I had it quite gold, I'm going to choose a gold colour and make that quite dark. I'm going to put the specular and the hardness up to their maximums. I'm then going to put mirror on and set that to 0.2, and we can just see it's gone a bit too light, so then I'm going to change the reflection colour to gold again, and that will serve as our basic material. So now I'm going to select the sphere, go to the particle tab, create a new particle system, and this number will depend on how big your scene is. The less the object has to travel, the less particles you'll need, and the further it travels, the more particles you'll need, because it'll be emitting particles per second. I think for mine I did 60,000, but just for this I'm going to set it to 15,000 just to speed things up a bit. We're going to start emitting particles at 1, and we're going to end at around 230. Lifetime, that'll be 75, so the particles will disappear after a certain amount of time. And then we're going to put the random up so that they all disappear at a slightly different time. We're then going to emit from the volume, just because it gives a nice sphere effect. We're then actually going to put the normal at 0, because they don't actually have to travel very far. But we are going to turn on rotation, and on velocity in here, we're going to have a value of 0.75. I just happen to know that works. And this is the initial orientation, but how we want it to rotate throughout the animation, well, we want that to be random as well, and I'm going to set that to be 3.7. Now, the only setting in here is the drag, which will be 0.6, and that just holds the particles in the air for a bit. We don't want to render the UV sphere, we only want to render the particles, so we can uncheck that box. And then we want to render an object, and the object we want to render is plane.001. You can see I've named the objects very well. So we're going to choose that. We're going to change the size to be 0.012, and we're going to have a random size of 0.1. And then one last setting we need to change is the gravity. I'm actually going to put this really low at 0.02. So again, the particles will hang in the air a bit longer and give a nicer effect. I've actually made a mistake and I've only got 1500, so I will change that to 15,000. And you can see we're getting a really good effect now. And it does get a bit slower because it's having to produce a lot of particles. And you can see they're just starting to fade out all randomly, so it's nice and smooth. Now, one problem that isn't so visible when we've got this few particles, so I'm just going to put it up to 30,000, and it will get a bit slower, so we'll just go back and replay. And this will depend on the speed of your object, but you can almost see little gaps where particles are not being emitted along the path. And that's a slight limitation of the particle system in Blender at the moment, where if an object is having its position controlled by another object, so this object which is emitting the particles is being controlled by the path, then it will only emit particles every frame, whereas a normal particle system will emit particles in between the frames, and so we get this slight banding effect. As I said, it does depend on the speed the object is moving, and it will become more apparent the faster it moves, so just to counter that, and making sure we've got our animation exactly how we want it, we're going to bake out this animation to be final. And that means we're going to turn this path animation into actual keyframes. So I'm going to go Object, Animation, and Bake Action, which brings up this little window with a few options. We want the start frame to be 1 and the end to be 250. I'm going to change the frame step to be 3, which basically says it will only keyframe every 3 frames, which is more than good enough for us. We only want the selected object. We want to clear the path constraint. It's not a pose, it's an object. And then we're going to do OK. And now you can see we've got a nice amount of keyframes here. And if I just scroll forward, you may not be able to see it, but we're actually not getting the banding effect anymore. So that we can see what we're doing, I'm going to give it a render. But first I'm going to set up a few world settings. So I'll do a new world, set the background to be black. I want environment lighting, but only 0.1. Over to the world texture tab, I'm just going to click new image and then choose image or movie. So I'm just going to add an HDR image, and if you don't have one of those, you can go on the internet and download some for free. And this just creates fake reflections for our objects. And this means that all our glitter will be able to reflect something. I'm going to choose this one and open it. And just because I know this works, the colours I'm going to use are 0.8, 0.9 and 0.5. And that just gives it a nice golden colour. And then I'm going to give our actual text a material. So I'm going to do new. I'm going to Control-C over the colour of the particle. And then I'm going to Control-V over this field and it will paste the colour. I'm going to put the specular hardness up to the maximum again. But instead of adding reflection, because I found it was just slowing the render down too much, we're going to add a texture which will act as a fake reflection. So I'm going to do new, image. I'm then going to choose the HDR image I just used, and then we're going to use slightly different colours here, which is 0.7, 0.8, and 0.4. And then I'm just going to change the brightness, contrast, and the saturation. Now obviously this will be different if you're using a different HDR image, so you will need to play around with this. And one setting I forgot about in the world settings was the influence. We need to tick these boxes just so it affects all parts of the sky instead of just the top and bottom. Now we can see we've got the preview in there. I'll just go back to the material and the texture for the object, and I'm going to change its mapping to be reflection, and that will give it a fake reflection by mapping texture onto where it thinks it should be. So I'm just going to play this through so we can get to a point where we've got some nice particles to show. I'm just going to pause it there. I'm going to change the render to be 50% just for the tutorial, and then I'm going to change the shading to be straight alpha so that we don't see the HDR image in the background. And if I render that, we can see the effect we're getting. And I'm actually going to change the environment lighting to be 0.5 instead of 0.1, and we'll give that a re-render. And you can see it's nice and bright. We've got that texture mapped on as if it's reflection, so it still renders quick. And we've got our particles looking all nice and shiny. And you can see because they're all rotating randomly, some are catching the light and some aren't, giving that sparkling glitter effect. To enhance that, we're now going to do a bit of compositing. I'm actually going to turn off the particle system for a minute because it's making my system a bit slow while I'm recording. We're going to go to the node editor. We want to use compositing nodes. We do want to use nodes, and we want a backdrop so we can see what we're doing. I'm going to quickly Shift A and add an output viewer, which is what provides the image to the background, so we can see what we're doing. I'm then going to zoom in by pressing Alt V, and what we're going to do, we're going to add a slight glare to these particles, and we're also going to correct some transparency issues. So I'm going to do Shift A, color alpha over. And this node would normally be used for combining two images and using their transparency. But what we're going to do is kind of force it to take into account some of the transparency around those particles. And I'm going to change that to black again. So what we're effectively doing is mixing our original image with a black background. And you can see this is effectively the original render we had. So I'm going to check the tick box that says Convert to Premul. And what this does is say, take into account that some of these pixels should be transparent, and we're not seeing that at the moment. So if you tick it, everything reduces a bit because it's now taking into account that some of the edge pixels should be transparent. Now we're going to add a glare node, so Shift A, filter glare, and we'll link that up to the viewer. You can already see we've got an effect. I am going to reduce it a bit. I'm going to set it to high quality. I'm then going to put the threshold to 4, which basically says glare less of the image. And then I'm going to set color modulation to be 0, so it all stays the same color. And what I'm going to do is add Shift A color mix, link that up, and then we're going to link this original pre-glare image in, and we're going to switch these around. Now we're back to what we had, and now if we reduce this number to say 0.1, we can fade out the glare effect. And so if you increase this, it increases the glare. And if you reduce it, it reduces the glare because we're mixing between a glared version and a non-glared version. And now we're on to the final part where we actually fade out the 3D text. So I'm going to select our text, go over to the material for it, and then the texture panel. We're going to, in a new texture slot, we're going to add a new texture, and it's going to be a blend. We set the preview to be both so we can see what's going on. You can see it's all gone pink. That's just because of the default colour that Blender uses. And what we're actually doing is creating a gradient of where the text is going to fade out. And I'm going to set this to be vertical because I want it fade top to bottom. I'm then going to move down and say, I don't want you to affect the colour, but I want you to affect the alpha transparency. So I'm just going to move that. You see it says alpha. But we're still not seeing anything. So we go back to material, enable transparency so that that texture can control the alpha, and then set the alpha to be 0 so that we're not reducing the effect of the texture at all. And you can see it's really started to fade out. Now the important setting on here is the mapping we're going to use, and we're going to use object mapping. And if you haven't used this before, we're going to create another object which is going to control the position of the texture on this object. So to hopefully make that a bit more simple, we're going to Shift A, add a mesh plane. We're going to go into wireframe and just scale it up and position it so it's roughly the shape. I'm then going to press Ctrl A to apply the scaling I just did. And I'm actually going to go into the object settings and change its display mode to wire, just because we don't need it. We only need to see the border. And this is plane 002. We're going to go back to the text material, back to the texture, and use plane 002. So now what's going to happen is this gradient is going to be mapped onto our plane, and so if we were to move the plane about, it would affect the position of the texture on the 3D text. So I'm just going to press Ctrl H to make sure this plane doesn't render, and then give it a render, and you can see it's fading out. So at the beginning of the animation, I want the plane to be down here, and as the sphere gets around here, I'm going to put a keyframe in on the plane for position, so for location, and when it gets to about here, the plane should be moving up about here, so I location, and then on frame 250 I'll move it up, and just to make sure it's all covered, we'll do I location again, and I will explain how this texture works in just a second. So a few things we need to do to the texture before it will work properly. It's because it's fading the wrong way. I'm just going to click negative, so now it's fading the other way. So if I go somewhere in the middle and render this, you can see it's starting to fade in the text. Now obviously you may need to fine tune it because it depends where you want the fade to be. But if we move along a bit, we've now got more text revealed. You can see it's taken into account those partially transparent pixels. And when we get to the very end, we've got fully visible text. Now, I said I was going to explain how this texture worked. As I said, the gradient is mapped onto this plane. Now, the gradient is set to only control the alpha transparency. So wherever it is white, it will be fully transparent. When we're down here, this gradient is effectively carrying on. So we've got the black down here, the grey in the middle, from here to here, and then we've got the white at the top of the plane, which is here. And the white will continue up, meaning it's transparent at the beginning. Now when it moves up, we're starting to get a bit of grey, and the grey means it'll be a bit transparent and a bit solid, so we'll start to see it appear. And when it moves all the way up to here, we'll have top being still transparent, because that'll be where the white is, and the bottom, where the black is, will be fully visible, and the middle will be a gradient of in between. So that's why at the end, we move it all the way up to the top, so that it's fully black at the top, and so will be fully visible. That is the basic technique. I hope you found this useful, and if you like it, please say so in the comments. And if you have any suggestions for other tutorials, please also say that. And I hope to see you in the next tutorial. Goodbye.